But what it actually really made clear was that the people are hungry for real connection, for actually putting forth a vision of what it is that our communities want to see, what our communities need, right, to not just survive, but to really thrive, and to be at the center of the city, not at the margins, but actually at the center. And that work really, that sort of moment really sparked the work that the Grassroots Collaborative did this last year, when after the mayor was elected and the city council changed in some ways, we did a power analysis of kind of like examining, all right, so what does the situation actually look like in the city now? And our realization was actually pretty clear that Mayor Emanuel wasn't our target, that the corporate agenda behind the mayor was our target. And that unless we actually took on the corporate agenda in Chicago, we were going to kind of be in our issue silo. We're going to be talking about the things that are really key and really important and tangible, yet never really changing the narrative of what's actually wrong, what's going on, and where the power really lies in the city. So we began a campaign to take on the corporate agenda in Chicago. We did this by talking about subsidies and how subsidies in Chicago are spent and where it gets spent and who gets that money and who doesn't get the money. And it's been the fight that we've organized around for this last year with a lot of the friends in this room. So lots of friends who are part of this effort. What was really obvious was that there is this opportunity here to move forward stuff and to move forward an agenda of not just of what we were against, but what we were for. And with Occupy blooming, it was really amazing in terms of what that did for our local organizing and the work that we've been doing in communities of color, people of the global majority, working families, what they've really led for decades with minimal attention, with being pushed to the side. Suddenly there's a platform for that work, right, that we've been doing forever. We got named as Occupy Chicago for everything we did, and we're okay with that, right? Because we don't care what you call us as long as you cover what it is that we're talking about. And through our organizing around subsidies, what became really obvious was it was a way for us to take on what the mayor was doing and what his corporate friends were doing in the city, and continue to do without change when it was Daley or when it was Emanuel. It's the same issues and the same struggle. The fact that tax increment financing, TIF dollars, are spent, a vast majority of that money is spent downtown, though that money was meant for blighted communities, right? So when you look at a map of where the money gets spent, and what that means is that downtown areas, wealthier neighborhoods, have literally tens of millions of extra dollars every year to spend on fixing streets, on potholes, on the stuff that they have that money to spend on, whereas communities of color, communities of the people of the global majority really don't, on top of having the issues be magnified hugely, on top of it, don't have access to this whole other layer, this whole other system of racial inequity. Nobody talks about TIFs as a system of racial inequity, but it's very clear that that's what it is, right? It allows the money to be, our tax dollars, instead of going to schools, parks, libraries, mental health clinics, instead of our money going to those places, instead what it does is it goes into the hands of downtown developers, into the corporate elite, into the poor babies at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange that are struggling to pay their tax bills despite making $1 billion in profit last year, $430 million the first quarter of this year. This is what we're up against, right? And this is when we knew that we can't just sort of we can't talk about housing or foreclosure or schools or any of this stuff without naming the corporate agenda that we're up against, without naming racial equity. It's at the forefront of what we do. We can never talk about economic issues without talking about racial justice. And if every time that we feel scared to talk about race, it's a place that we're scared to look at how racism has affected our own lives, or our own, like it's this place where we have to actually take this work on. Because without naming it, we continue to, that inequity continues to, that's the greatest power that those in power have against us, right, is to be able to use economics to divide us. And in fact, what we've realized and what we feel is very key is that we've got to talk about how race actually connects all of us, and how it is actually the issue that we have to take on and name. So we did actually, when we were trying to get a couple $100 million of TIF money back into the schools, parks, and libraries, we only got 60. But we're, $60 million, we're okay with that. We're not okay with that, actually. We wanted more. It leaves hundreds of millions of dollars on the table. But at a time when cities across the country are slashing public services, that I think, And again, slashing public services because it's a direct way to slash public employees, which is a direct way to break unions, which is a direct way to undermine, in particular, the black middle class in this country. Right? We have to take on this fight, and we have to figure out how to get money back into the public sector, particularly when the money is not in the public services, it's going into the hands of the corporate elite, right? Which is what the system sets up. So what I want to say is, we've got a lot more work to do. We wanted to change the narrative. We certainly haven't. This is all of our work together, but we are shifting it, right? We are raising questions that haven't been raised before. People are talking about economic inequities, and when people have never talked about this issue before. I think we've got to get to the place where we've got folks talking about racial inequity as well. We've got a lot more work to do there around gender justice, around trans justice, around all of these sort of places of work. We've got to figure out how to weave all this into anything that we do. So there's a couple things that I want to say. Point 2 was in there somewhere now in section 3. In a time of defeats, it's really critical that we claim our victories, right? So small or big, we've got to claim the victories. So this is where even I say, well, 60 million. Some people say the mayor was going to put money in anyway, although publicly he was insisting he was never going to use TIF money to actually address budget issues. We claim it as a victory, and it's important for us to claim it as a victory because we are constantly facing defeat. We're constantly facing discouragement in our communities that there's nothing possible, there's nothing that we can do, there's no point in trying. And I think, again, what's really brilliant about what Occupy has done is this sort of expanded imagination, right, of what's possible, of what this society actually could look like, and that it could actually reflect what it is that each of us as individuals want to see. We've also got to move beyond single-issue organizing, right? So how do we connect the dots, but how do we do it in a way that really does lead to, so our folks can feel the win? And I think that's part of what was hard with even this budget fight was, our communities, which we've got 11 organizations that make up the Grassroots Collaborative, primarily in the South and West Sides, but also in Humboldt Park. And do people really feel the win of 60 million? It's really debatable. I mean, it really meant that there were just less cuts and they were going to cut, right? How do you feel less cuts, right? So, I mean, there's still, our work really needs to continue in terms of how do we make sure that people can really feel the win. And then I would say that, oppression really works to undermine our brilliance, this piece around our minds, right? And what the impact of freedom and our minds being free in Mumia. Constantly, the oppression that we're up against works to undermine our minds, right? It works to make us feel like we're not enough, we can't do this, like this isn't our place, whatever all the messages we get as women, as people of the global majority, as queer folks, as young people, as all of that, right? And I think that's really, we can't just work to overthrow a system without working to reclaim our minds, right? To get our minds free, because once we get into power, what's going to look different if our minds are still have the effects of racism and sexism and homophobia and classism, right? So we've got to do that. And part of that, I think, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, is that we've actually got to connect in real ways. I'm really just sort of humbled by how many people are squeezed into this room. And the thing that I want to say, and there's an opportunity in this moment. We can't just talk about building connections. Let's do it, right? Let's actually do it. How many times have you come into places where you hear a panel of people talk, 3 people with loud mouths talk and answer questions that aren't really questions, but are kind of 10-minute statements, and then everybody leaves, right? So we're not going to do that today. We're actually going to connect with each other, and so is this okay to do this now? All right. So part of what I want us to actually do is, somebody told me this was about church. I don't know. I didn't go to church growing up, but this turn to your neighbors thing. I don't know. Is this church? I don't know. We didn't do this in Temple, but what I want you to do actually, it is really, you've heard a lot of stuff here, but you all are engaged in this in some way, right? There's a million stories that each of us carry, sort of feelings around all this stuff, what's right, what's wrong, what are our next steps, and it's really critical that we all get a chance to speak and to be heard. And half the time, I think part of the speaking is really critical, but listening, I think, is the biggest piece of all, right? So how do we actually really listen to each other and really understand where we're coming from? And so what I actually want us to do is this, it is an exercise that you're gonna want to fight me on, but please try. So we're gonna